Well, one idea is the Circe effect. Okay, and so here on some ancient Greek vase, then is Circe, who is a Greek goddess, and here is a man that she's transformed into part man, part pig. Okay, and so this is a story from Homer's Odyssey, one of the greatest epic poems from the classical period, from ancient Greece, and so it sort of fits with the poetry theme of this class. And so, what is this? What is the Circe story? Well, I'll just read it to you here. Um, some of Odysseus's men were wandering around on the island of Aia when they heard beautiful singing coming from the house of a goddess named Circe and couldn't resist calling upon her, knocking on her door. Okay, and so this is a direct quote then from Richard Lattimore's translation of the Odyssey. Quote, and at once she opened the shining doors and came out and invited them in, and all in their innocence entered. She brought them inside and seated them on chairs and benches and mixed them a potion with barley and cheese and pale honey added to Pramnian wine. Next thing, she struck them with her wand and drove them into her pig pens, and they took on the look of pigs with the heads and voices and bristles of pigs. Okay, so what's happened here? Circe has, through her beautiful voice, and actually also it says in the Odyssey, through her beautiful weaving, she has attracted these men into her home. And then once they were there, she then transformed them into these, hideous pig men. Okay? And so what does that have to do with OMP decarboxylase? Well, the Circe effect is sometimes called ground state destabilization, GSD. And so the idea is that we can think of two ways that we might accelerate a reaction: ground state destabilization and transition state stabilization. So GSD, ground state destabilization, and TSS, transition state stabilization. So transition state stabilization is how we normally think of enzymes working. What they do is to stabilize the transition state relative to the ground state. Okay, and so if this is the free energy diagram for the uncatalyzed reaction, in red here, then we see the free energy diagram for the catalyzed reaction. And so the transition state has been stabilized. We've reduced this free energy barrier to the reaction, and in that way, we've accelerated the reaction. But at least in theory, there's another possibility. Instead of stabilizing the transition state, maybe what we can do is to destabilize the ground state. And so that's the idea of ground state destabilization. And so this green tracing here shows what would happen if we increased the free energy of the ground state without changing the free energy of the transition state. We've still reduced this free energy barrier. And so potentially then we've still accelerated the reaction. Okay, and so down here is shown how this might apply to OMP decarboxylase. Here is OMP then bound hypothetically in the active site of OMP decarboxylase. And the idea is that there's a very favorable binding pocket for the ribose 5-phosphate part of OMP, the unreactive part of OMP. And so that's, equivalent to Circe's beautiful singing, attracting the men into her home. This very attractive binding site for ribose 5-phosphate then attracts OMP into the active site. But then it places the reactive part of the molecule in this very stressful environment, perhaps by placing this negatively charged carboxylate group on OMP really close to a negatively charged carboxylate group on an aspartate side chain in the OMP active site. Okay. And so in that way, then we've stressed out the OMP, we've destabilized the ground state, and in that way, perhaps we've accelerated the reaction. Okay, there's a bit of a problem with this idea of ground state destabilization. It's been found to apply to a handful of enzymes, but in the case of ODC, OMP decarboxylase, it's difficult to imagine how we could achieve the necessary level of rate enhancement just from ground state destabilization, because theoretical calculations show that you would need to destabilize the ground state by something like 23 kilocalories per mole to achieve the observed rate acceleration solely through ground state destabilization. And that's very unlikely. I mean, if the reactive part of the molecule were under so much stress that resulted in a destabilization of 23 kcals per mole, chances are OMP would just never bind in the active site. In other words, the interaction of the non-reactive portion of the molecule with this binding pocket is unlikely to be favorable enough to counteract this unfavorable 23 kcal per mole interaction here. Okay, so what's going on then? How do we explain the tremendous catalytic proficiency of OMP decarboxylase? Well, the answer is we don't really know the answer, but one very logical possibility is that the proficiency of ODC results from a combination of ground state destabilization and transition state stabilization. Neither by themselves can give the necessary catalytic proficiency, but the two of them together then maybe can combine to give you that tremendous catalytic proficiency.